If you ever watch the award ceremonies, people stand on the stage and they take all of the credit for everything that they've ever done. Don't get me wrong, those musicians and movie stars and superstar sports athletes, they're incredibly talented. But where does that talent come from? You see, today in the life of Joseph, in Genesis chapter 41, we see this guy go from a pit and a prison to standing in front of Pharaoh, the most powerful man on earth. And Joseph has every opportunity to take credit for the ability to interpret dreams, but he doesn't. And I think what you're going to see from this dude today is a guy who wants to get out of the way so that people can see the God that he serves more than they can see him. And one of the greatest challenges a man will ever have to face is the challenge of putting ourselves to the side and becoming transparent, allowing people to see Jesus in us instead of just seeing us. So I want you to see today from Genesis chapter 41, from the life of Joseph, this descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how transparency is the only way for people to see Jesus in you. Check this out today, will you?
I want you to know right out of the gate where we're going to go today. Transparency, it's right there on the screens for you, is the only way for people to see Jesus inside of you. Now, the very word transparency means that people can see through something, and it's you that we want to talk about people seeing through today. But let me define what I mean by this word transparency for all of us today. Here's what I mean by this word. It's when you go to your life group this week and you're meeting together in people's houses, and these people know you and they love you, and they ask you, hey man, how you doing? How's your week been this week? You don't use this word as an answer. Fine. Because the truth is, if it's not fine, these people know you. They love you. They care deeply about what's happening inside of you. And if it's not fine, they want to know that things are not fine. Now, let's just get real for a second. If you're at work this week and somebody asks you the same question, if you're at the gym this week and people ask you, hey, how are things going? It doesn't matter if you tell them that things are fine or not. They don't know. They don't care. They really don't even want an honest answer. In fact, you could tell them my mom dropped acid and hijacked a school bus full of penguins. They wouldn't even hear it because they're not even listening. They're not paying any attention. But the people that know you, the people that love you, they want to see what's going on inside of you. And they want to see how your relationship with Christ is. And the only way for that to happen is you and I have to get out of the way so that people can see Jesus at work in us and at work through us. Listen, if there's a guy who is not fine in life at this point, it's Joseph. If you haven't been with us over the last several weeks, Joseph has been sold by his family into slavery. He has been erroneously or inappropriately accused of sexual assault, and now he's in a dungeon. I'm saying by the time you get to Genesis chapter 41, besides Jesus and perhaps Job from the Bible, no one has it worse than Joseph today. And things are not fine with Joseph. And even in the midst of this brutal circumstance that he's in, you see a guy who is absolutely honest, who never considers compromising his integrity. In fact, what he does today is just mind-blowing. And I dare anyone in this room to do what Joseph does today. You see, Joseph has a faith, a profound, powerful faith. And Joseph is going to try to leave an impression on some people around him today because of his faith. I say this around here a lot. Faith is entirely personal. That means you cannot force what you believe on somebody else. You can't make another person believe what you believe. But even though it's personal, it's not supposed to be private. You and I, if you really want to live the kind of life where people see Jesus in you, then you and I have to get out of the way and let people see a God that's big and at work inside of us. And we have to be willing to say what we believe, just like Joseph does today. Genesis 41, starting in verse 1, Pharaoh has some dreams, and this puts Joseph in the national spotlight. At the end of 2 years, the Bible starts, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing beside the Nile when seven healthy-looking, well-fed cows came up from the Nile, and they began to graze among the reeds. Oh, that's nice. After them, 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the riverbank of the Nile. That's weird. And then the sickly, thin cows ate the healthy, well-fed cows. Okay, that's just gross. Then Pharaoh woke up, he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 heads of grain, plump and good, came up from one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. Now, the east wind is very important. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump, full ones. And then Pharaoh woke up. And it was only a dream. And when morning came, he was troubled. Will you say troubled out loud? This is a really, really important word in this chapter. He was troubled, so he summoned all of the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. By the time you get to this point in the Bible, Joseph knows more than a thing or two about dreams. Joseph has had some dreams. He told his brothers and his father about his dreams, and it didn't go too well for him. There was a cupbearer and a chief baker that had some dreams. Joseph interpreted those dreams, and they turned out exactly like he explained. And now Pharaoh has dreams. And in actuality, it's not 2 dreams. It's really 1 dream that just happens twice with 2 different sources here. And when Pharaoh wakes up, Pharaoh knows something is really, really wrong here. Pharaoh just can't figure it out. So like anybody, Pharaoh's going to gather all of his smart people around him, and Pharaoh's going to ask them to help him out here, but no one can answer this question. And what I'm trying to tell you, church, is this just became a national emergency. Something really, really wrong is happening. We can't figure out what it is. We need help. And if you're reading the Bible for the first time, you can't miss that Joseph has just spent an additional 2 years in a dungeon. He just did a solid for Pharaoh's cupbearer and begged him, when you go back in front of Pharaoh, would you let him know that I shouldn't be here? I'm an innocent man. In fact, I shouldn't even be in Egypt right now. I should be back in Canaan with my family. And the guy blows him off. I wonder if this cupbearer is so selfish that when he gets out of prison, I don't care about this Hebrew slave. I don't care about anybody but me. And he forgets about him completely. Joseph is languishing in prison. Best we can tell, this is now 20 years. Get this, church. 20 years that Joseph has been a slave or a prisoner in a foreign land and did absolutely nothing to deserve it. And I kind of wonder what your prayers would be like if you were Joseph at the 20-year mark. Would you be begging God to get you out of these circumstances? Or, as I asked last week, would you start to take matters into your own hands? Would you start to try to figure out how to do a prison break? Or worse, would you say, you know what? One of these days, I'm going to get my revenge. I'm going to get my revenge against Potiphar's wife for this. I'm going to get my revenge against my brothers for me even being in this country in the first place. For whatever reason, Joseph stays in prison and he never compromises his integrity. In fact, he sees this as an opportunity to tell people about his God. Joseph has a character that's unlike anyone or anything else in the Bible up to this point. And Joseph's character is what makes it possible for him to start to turn the conversation. It's not about me. It's not about Pharaoh. This is about God. And only when you're really honest with yourself can you be honest with other people about what God is doing in you and what God is doing through you. This is why the word fine just doesn't work for God's people anymore. Listen to what happens next. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Oh, my bad. Today I remember my fault. Pharaoh was angry with his servant, and he put me and the chief baker in the custody of the captain of the guards. He and I had dreams on the same night, and each dream had its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew, a slave of the captain of the guard, and I should pause to tell you, that is not a compliment. In fact, what he's doing is he is telling Pharaoh, this guy's color of skin, this guy's culture, his country is inferior to ours. And by the way, he probably sexually assaulted Pharaoh's wife, and he deserves to be in prison. But there's a dude in prison who was with us, and we told him our dreams, and he interpreted our dreams for us. Each had its own interpretation, and it turned out just the way that he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man, he was hanged." And then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and they quickly brought him from the dungeon. Can I show you from the Bible just how miserable, just how terrible this life would have been like for Joseph? Listen to this. He shaved and changed his clothes and went to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I've had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said about you that you can interpret, you can hear dreams and interpret it." And I wonder how many of us, this would have been the first words out of your mouth. "I'm not able to," Joseph answered Pharaoh, "but it is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Joseph is saying, I really hope to God this is good news. What I'm trying to say, church, is Joseph is in a perfect position right now to plead his cause, to declare his innocence, to beg Pharaoh to get me out of my circumstances. But Joseph doesn't do it. In fact, right now, Joseph's first thought is Pharaoh and the honor of his God. And although Joseph has interpreted some dreams, the cupbearer and the chief baker's dreams, and he's interpreted them correctly, Joseph doesn't take credit for that situation. I want to ask you, in fact, I dare anyone in this room, anyone listening to my voice, you're in prison for a crime you didn't commit, and you get called in front of the only person on earth that can give you a pardon, and he asks a favor of you. Do you ask them to pardon you? Because that never shows up today from Joseph's language. In fact, today, Joseph never describes his plight before Pharaoh today. And I dare anyone in this room to be in this miserable situation that Joseph's in and not think about yourself. Think about Pharaoh, or think about the glory of God instead of thinking about yourself. This is the point where we draw attention to ourselves instead of to what God is doing around us. And sometimes there are tough situations that he leads us through, and it's no fun, and we don't want to be in the middle of it. But even in the middle of those circumstances, God is still working in us. And God might even be working in the middle of those really painful circumstances for something much bigger and much more important in the future. And when you take the credit, you're deceiving people around you about who Jesus is and about what Jesus is doing in you and what Jesus is doing through you. But church, if I could be honest, you're deceiving yourself well before you start deceiving others. See, when you start thinking, it's because of me that I've got to this point and all of these awesome things in my life, it's because of how hard I worked and how talented I am and how many opportunities that I seized. All of those are chances for you to give the glory away to Jesus or to take it for yourself, but you can't do both. And Joseph has every chance right now to look Pharaoh in the eyes and say, yep, I can interpret dreams. In fact, things would go better for him in prison and in the dungeon if Joseph took the credit, and he doesn't. He has the courage to speak some hard truth, and I am certain when Joseph hears these dreams, in his heart he's thinking, oh God, no. I don't want to have to tell Pharaoh what these dreams mean. Nobody wants to hear out loud what these dreams mean. Joseph only has the opportunity to stand in front of Pharaoh, let alone to speak some hard truth to him, because he's a man of character and integrity. And at this point, he has done nothing in 20 years to deserve what he's going through. But he also hasn't compromised himself in the middle of it. And so now Joseph hears the dreams, and I am beyond doubt that he wants to deliver some good news. And most of us would try to figure out a way to make this bad news a little bit more palatable, but Joseph doesn't. Verse 17. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile when 7 well-fed, healthy-looking cows came up from the Nile and grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, weak and very sickly and very thin, came up. I've never seen such sickly ones as these in all of the land of Egypt. Can I pause for just a second? Obviously, when Pharaoh describes these dreams a second time to Joseph, Pharaoh is disturbed about the sickly cows, about the sickly sickly heads of grain. Like that's where all of his attention is at this point in Genesis. Then the thin, sickly cows ate the first 7 well-fed cows. And check this out. When they had devoured them, you couldn't tell that they had been devoured. They had devoured them. Their appearance was as bad as if it had been before. Then I woke up, and in a dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, coming up on one stalk. And after them, 7 heads of grain, withered, thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain, I don't even understand the anatomy of this, swallowed the 7 good ones. And I told this to the magicians. Think about the word priest right now. I told this to the magicians, but no one can tell me what it means. Pause. If you're Joseph, you're sitting there shaking in your shoes right now because you're thinking, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to say this. Here goes. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. And God, not Joseph, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dream means the same thing. The 7 thin, sickly cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 worthless heads of grain, scorched by the east wind, are 7 years of famine. It's just as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. And now here we go. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. Say the word abundance out loud. That's the good news. Everybody wants to hear the good news. Joseph is basically saying, hey, Pharaoh, you want the good news or the bad news? Bad news first. Okay, good news, going to be 7 years of abundance. After them, 7 years of famine will take place, and all of the abundance of the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because it has become, or remembered because of the famine that follows it. For the famine will be very severe. Since the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God. He will carry it out soon. And if you were to put into parentheses, no one and nothing, not you, Pharaoh, and not the God of the Nile River can do anything to stop what's about to happen next. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, Joseph does not want to answer this dream honestly, because everybody else wants good news. Pharaoh wants good news. The advisors are probably elbowing Joseph before he goes into the room like, yo, bro, you're in prison right now. It would be wise if you gave him some good news. For your sake, you know what I mean? And Joseph hears the dream, and Joseph interprets the dream, and notice his interpretation is so accurate that he doesn't hold back the bad news. There's going to be abundance. That's the good news. And then there's going to be adversity, and this adversity is going to be so severe that the 7 years of abundance will be wiped off of the books, and it will be like none of that ever happened. In fact, Pharaoh, your future and your kingdom is at stake right now. This will be so bad that if things don't change, you don't have a country 14 years from now. And Pharaoh, you're obviously focused on the weak heads of grain and these thin, sickly cows because it's going to be that terrible. And really, Joseph is saying it's going to happen. It's going to happen soon. In fact, by Joseph's language, you can almost interpret this as the 14 years has already started, Pharaoh. So you got no time to mess around. This is a high stakes game that Joseph is playing right now. Because if Pharaoh chooses to, he is an absolute total monarch. If he chooses to, he can just get mad and have Joseph thrown back in the dungeon. You know what? You offended me. I'm just going to cut your head off for what you said. He could do that if he wants to. Because can I remind you what happened in the book of Daniel when Nebuchadnezzar had some dreams and his magicians couldn't interpret the dreams? Nebuchadnezzar said, you guys are worthless. You know what? I'm just going to kill everybody because you don't do me any good. In fact, if you were to give me an answer, I don't even believe that I could trust your answer. You're just lying out of your teeth right now. In Nebuchadnezzar's case, he's just going to kill everybody. Pharaoh is giving Joseph an opportunity to give me some good news. And Joseph tells him, oh, it's going to get bad. It's going to get so bad that those 7 good years are going to be like they never even happened. And it starts now, and you better do something or else you're not going to have a kingdom. This is a high stakes game for Pharaoh. Because if Pharaoh doesn't listen, if Pharaoh decides this Hebrew slave doesn't know what he's talking about, this can't possibly happen in my country. Because check this out, y'all. The Nile River not only feeds the crops, not only do the crops feed the animals, but the entire economy of Egypt is built on the Nile River. And Joseph is saying, you're going to have a drought that is so bad that your Nile River can't help you out. In fact, you won't have a country 14 years from now if you don't listen to these dreams and make some pretty significant changes. And Joseph is putting his head on the chopping block just to be this real and just to be this honest with him. I want to ask a question of the Bible right now. Why is Joseph standing in front of Pharaoh? If he wasn't a man of honesty and integrity when he was in Pharaoh's house, he wouldn't have been put in charge, or in Potiphar's house, he wouldn't have been put in charge of all that Potiphar owns and all that all of his work, all of his land. If Joseph wasn't a man of integrity when he was thrown into the dungeon and gave honest answers to the chief cupbearer and baker, he wouldn't be standing in front of Pharaoh right now. If at any point along the way Joseph compromised his character, he wouldn't have the right to be honest with Pharaoh. And what I'm trying to say is, you earn the right to speak hard truths. It's easy to offend people. It's easy to be ugly with the truth, but the scriptures call Christians to something different. They call us to speak the truth in love. And it is only by your character, your integrity, that people are even willing to hear you, allow you to speak truth in the first place. And it's only by your heart that they're willing to receive that truth as truth given in love. It's far easier for Joseph right now to leave out the bad part. It's far easier for Joseph to try to minimize just how ugly this is about to become. But he doesn't. He doesn't hold anything back. And even now, he doesn't take credit, nor does he complain about being unjustly put in prison. And I don't think we would hear what the Bible says next if it wasn't for Joseph's character, if it wasn't for his integrity. Joseph does something unthinkable. He goes completely off script next. In fact, he says something that he has absolutely no right to say. And the only reason he can say it is because he's a trusted voice. Let me put things into context for you. Imagine that you're invited to the White House and you're there to consult on a very specific, very technical issue. And after you get done giving an answer to President Biden, you say, oh, by the way, now that I've answered that question for you, let me tell you what your foreign policy on China needs to be. Because that's exactly what Joseph does next. And before we even read from the Bible, I think we ought to ask ourselves, wait a second, why on earth is Joseph making this statement to the most powerful man on earth when this was not the question that he was asked? Genesis 41, starting in verse 33. Now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man. Notice he didn't say wise men, wise team, wise counsel. You better find yourself a wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take a fifth of the harvest of the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let them gather all of the excess food during these good years that are coming. Under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so that they may preserve it as food. The food will be a reserve for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. And then the country will not be, here it is on the screen. You can't miss what the Bible is saying. Don't get this wrong, Pharaoh, because if you do, your country will be wiped out by famine. We won't have an Egypt 14 years from now if you get this wrong, Pharaoh. Every day when you get up, God is doing some things around you. God is doing some things inside of you. And chances are God is doing some things to you. And every day this week, you have a chance to give God credit for what's happening in you and through you, or take credit for yourself. And you cannot do both. And the goal of transparency is to be so see-through that people no longer see Jeff, they only see Jesus. They no longer see Joseph, they only see Jesus at work in Joseph. I am convinced the only reason Joseph can stand in front of Pharaoh and give this advice is because Joseph hasn't asked for anything for himself at this point. He's only concerned about Pharaoh, about the future, and about his faith. And because it's not about Joseph, it's about everybody else. Joseph gets to stand in front of the man and deliver some really hard truth and some really profound advice. Would you bow your heads? And let me pray for us.
If you've got a friend, a family member, a brother in arms that you love but doesn't love Jesus, then this broadcast is built entirely for them. I hope that you will become transparent this week. I hope that you will reach out to that person. Maybe you'll just shoot them a text. Maybe you'll give them a call. Maybe you'll see them at the gym and say, hey man, would you check out this episode? And if they're willing to check it out, maybe that would be the opportunity for you to start a conversation so that you can become transparent. And that dude can see Jesus in you. I hope you enjoyed this episode from Struecker Ministries. I'll see you back here next time.